So one question I had in another group that I did a surrender talk just recently was a woman who was having a lot of trouble dealing with her mother, who's elderly and very negative. And I think that older generation who've gone through a lot, some of them were in the Depression, in the war, even recently in Europe, there's been wars. And she couldn't help being upset that no matter what she did for her mother, the response was always critical, negative. And she was like, well, how do I surrender? How do I, deal with something like this? And the family brings us our biggest lessons. There's no doubt about it. And when we got into it, I said, it doesn't sound like she was ever shown how to show love. Like, maybe this is her way of showing love, is this criticism and negativity. And I said, what was her childhood like? And it turns out she was one of 10 children. The parents probably didn't even know she was there. It was a farm family. Everyone was just working. And so she never received affection, never received love or hugs, and probably just got criticism and whatever from all her siblings. And I said, this is where the guru is teaching you to show love no matter what. So even though this may not be the mother you wished you'd had, the loving baking cookies kind of mom, I said, all you can do is show her love and just surrender it to Guruji. Just let him give her what she needs through you. Every time you show up in a selfless mode, he can help her through you. And that's one way that surrender is so important for helping Guruji. It helps shift the world just by bringing kindness and love to it, no matter what you're confronted with, no matter what the problem seems to be. Getting rid of the ego and I is a huge part of surrender. And if you just look at things from the perspective of how can I help? What could I do here to make this situation better than what it is? That is surrendering, because you will end up letting Guruji come through you and say things to people that you might not have thought of. And I've had situations where people have said, oh, what you said to me the other day was perfect. It changed everything. And I have no idea what I said. I can't remember what I said. And to me, that is when Guruji has just turned the mind off and taken over. And he can do it through all of us. Every single one of you has that ability to just let him operate through you. And you will say and do things for people that they need. So you don't need to have a degree in counseling or anything else. If you are just surrendered and coming from a place of love, every action you do will be perfect. And it won't have to be thought out ahead of time. You might want to do, say for a talk, you do a little bit of research and work, but then you just relax and go into that space. And what happens and the momentum that happens is just fantastic. And that's where surrender is just this great, great gift. It's something that all of the masters talk about. And there's a quote here I had from Ramanuja Acharya, who is the main Acharya teacher in our lineage. And he said, it's all about love and surrender. You can't have love without surrender. So just do surrender. Let go of the ego. So every time you have a thought about a situation, like, what am I going to get out of this? Or how much are they going to pay me? Then you've already stopped it. The ego's in charge and it's trying to organize things. And when you're surrendered, you don't have to ask those questions. I had this one soul brought to one of my meditation groups before lockdown, and the meditations were always free and people could leave donations if they wanted. And this one fellow, I, I felt the cracks in his armor were the same as mine. And so I sent him a note afterwards. He gave me his email. And I said, it seems like you were trying very hard to be normal in this group. And I sense that something profound has happened to you. And if you ever want to talk, we can talk. And it turned out he had tried to commit suicide and had been locked up in a mental institution for a while. And so someone decided to bring him to my meditation when he was released. So he was walking on eggshells. He was trying so hard to be a normal human being. And it was just heartbreaking because I remember being in that state. So I said, okay, whatever you need. And he was working in restaurants. And so every night he would text me when he got off work, like at 1 a.m. And I would just, text back, have a great night. And it was like he just needed a touchstone. He just needed to know that there was a human being in the world that cared about whether he was alive or dead. And we ended up, we'd go for long walks and talk. And back then I wasn't a Swami yet. And I was a freelance writer and I was in the film business. Month after month is going by and I was sort of like, okay, God, anytime now, it's great doing all this free counseling work. And the message I kept getting was just help, do what's in front of you. So the money was sort of dwindling but I just, whatever was in front of me every day, I did. And then out of nowhere, the biggest movie that had ever hit town, it was Christopher Nolan's Interstellar. And I got this call that the A-list person who was on the crew got sick. Could I come? And I never got on the big shows because I wasn't important enough or hadn't been in the business long enough. And I ended up on this massive film being paid more. The first paycheck I had for the first week was more than I had made in 3 months. And I took it to the accounting department and I said, I think there's a mistake. And they said, nope. Because we were working 18-hour days because of the union. After 8 hours it went up, then after 12 hours it went up. And by 18 hours, I was on triple time. And because I meditated and did yoga, I could be back at work within 4 hours. Whereas the rest of the crew had to have their 8-10 hours off, because they'd go for a beer after work or, whatever they did. So I was the only one on the crew that could repeatedly work 18-hour days, and which meant I was always on triple time. And so the running joke was, oh, she's meditating, because whenever I didn't have to work, I would just turn off. I'd turn off my mind, I'd turn off my system. And then as soon as they needed me, I was in full gear again. And I got to travel with them and we were in 5-star hotels and the little voice goes, see, I told you I'd pay you. So even though I got down to my last dollar helping this poor soul who had no money, couldn't pay me, right, was just broken. That's what God needed me to do at that time. Needed me to help that one because I was the only one in the region available. And by doing that, I was rewarded later. So, it's good to be diligent and make sure the bills are paid and everything else. But when you surrender, the path starts going like this. It's not a straight line anymore, but it's delightful and it's lovely. And you don't have to worry. And worry actually blocks these miracles from happening. So if your mind tries to worry, have a stern talk with it, sit it down and tell it to behave, because worrying blocks it. And I had a poster in our place when we were in California, my son and I, and it was Paramahansa Yogananda. And it was one of his sayings, always enthusiastically expect the best. And it's because your enthusiasm attracts it, whereas worry and negativity, fear pushes it away. So solutions are attracted to you by your enthusiasm, by your love. So let that be your state. Let that always be your natural state. And the rest of it will keep trying to come in. And that's why Guruji said he knows it's hard and it takes baby steps, but you can't afford the luxury of allowing negative thoughts, worry, fear, because it will sabotage your life. So always stay in that place of love, compassion, and if you are really feeling like you're crashing and burning, go help somebody. Right? That's as soon as you take your mind off yourself and help somebody else, it's amazing what will. And some of you have heard my story about I'd been working in the greenhouses as a laborer after we got off the streets, and finally I threw a temper tantrum with God and I said, damn it, I'm a writer, I'm not a laborer, and I quit that job. And so I was immediately offered a job as a housekeeper to clean this old man's house. But it turned out he was a famous artist. And when he heard I was a writer, he hired me to write his memoir because he was famous. And he was a recluse. So he had no ability to meet writers. And so it was only by showing up at his house as a house cleaner that we were able to meet. And I ended up living with him for a year while he was dying and writing his biography. So, as a writer, I could have never planned that event, right? I just couldn't have possibly fathomed, how do you meet a recluse? I didn't even know he existed. He was hidden away in his beautiful home, and he was like a hoarder. His life had become so small that there was stacks of newspapers and it was dark and just kind of depressing. And when I got in there as a house cleaner and I just started to bring light back into the place, and then he was inspired to say, can I see something you've written? And his work was in the Smithsonian, and they had been asking him for his memoir because he survived concentration camps during the Second World War. And his story was spectacular. And it was a story of divine guidance, even though he was just this crusty old war vet. And when I tried to say, oh, that was like divine intervention, he was like, he was just one of those grumpy old guys. But obviously, it was not his time to die. He was just saved over and over and over again, and came to America, and the first art competition he entered, he won and became world famous within months of coming to America. So he was surrendered without even knowing it. So it's not even about you being highly religious or spiritual. If you just understand that you were created by a force and that force is guiding you, let it take over. And in my case, it's obvious to me that it was Guruji all along. So that's who I see when I have my conversations. But any of you, it's whatever you relate to as being that higher force, just surrender to it. So has anybody come up with a question or a comment?
May I?
Yes.
Swamini, if I not misunderstood, you said that you first was a laborer in this greenhouse, and then you decided to not to work there, and then this cleaning house job came to you in a way. Am I right?
Yeah, so I was attending the Self-Realization Fellowship at that point. So that's Paramahansa Yogananda's ashram in California. And I remember I quit the greenhouse, and on New Year's Eve, they had a meditation at the temple. And I put my last dollar in the donation dish. And I said, I'm a writer, I'm done. And I realized too that as long as I was just putting up with being a writer, the universe couldn't give me any, or putting up with being a laborer, the universe couldn't help me. So when I set the intention,
Okay.
you know, that I'm going to step up and no matter what it means, I'm going to follow my path and be a writer. Immediately, I was given a house cleaning job that got me to the man who would hire me as a writer. So even though it takes some experience to get over that nervousness, because I remember that.
You know, I asked this question because we are talking about surrendering, and you made an intention, and you come to a determination, and then you decide something, that you give up a job because you know that you are a writer, and you know, because there is a fine line,
Right.
you know. That's my question,
Yes.
actually. Because
Because, you know, Guruji talks about how some of us are living in fantasy worlds, and that's dangerous because, and I think because my path kept being led by my writing. When I was in Canada, Walt Disney wanted some of my screenplays for kids. And that's why I moved to California. And so that was the step to get me there. But then all the meetings just turned into weirdness. And there's a thing called development hell in the movie business where people keep getting involved to develop your films and they never make them. And you just keep rewriting your scripts and they don't pay you, and it's development hell. And so I had to just go back to working because that wasn't paying any money. And so each step was led by my writing, but whenever I would back off the writing and do something else, my life would go into a weird neutral, just idling. So when I set the intention that I would become a writer again, and I didn't know how to do it, then the universe could start creating paths again.
yes.
So, and I think that's where the Kriya Yoga, because I learned the early Kriya Yoga that Yoganandaji had come up with, you know, that Babaji gave him. I was doing that. And so that had started me clearing my mind and getting better at listening to the inner voice. And now, of course, Guruji's Atma Kriya Yoga is even bigger, right? It has brought in a whole other dimension. So that's where your sadhana, and as Guruji says, knowledge, you have to keep clearing away the garbage inside so that when we do get that message of taking a leap, quitting your job and heading into, right? You have to have clarity inside of you. It can't be done out of a fantasy that, you know, when California, I had so many writers come to me for advice and they were living in fantasy worlds. They weren't learning the craft. They weren't attending workshops. They weren't in the business. They were hiding in their rooms, fantasizing about being a writer and not doing anything about it. So that's where the mind is used as a tool. I learned how to be a writer, and you know, and I workshopped with other people, and I joined writers groups so that I knew what I was doing. But if I had just stayed sitting in Calgary fantasizing about being a writer, that's ridiculous. And you'll hear. Go ahead.
Then also, if you come up with a strong determination and strong decision, with this guidance, not with this fantasy guidance, you know, with this inner guidance and divine guidance, then he helps you. He just helps you. This is your example, actually.
Right. And when when he sees you, you know, get ready to roll, then he can just pour his help and energy on you and create the right connections and the right people. Right. He needs to see you're ready to do the work. I think I saw a question pop up here in the chat. Could you tell us more about the steps or stages of surrender? So I think an important first step is developing that inner dialogue with, as Guruji keeps saying, he's sitting in our heart. So don't ignore him. Don't be on a date on your text, on your cell phone. Understand that there is a presence in you all the time, and start talking to it. Start having those conversations. Get up in the morning and go, what should we do today? And just act like your best friend is with you all of the time. And there's an expression, fake it till you make it. So even if it means you're just pretending your best friend is with you, all of a sudden you will feel it. You'll feel these waves and rushes and love. And when you find people just bursting into tears at the thought of Guruji, that's where that is coming from, that overwhelming feeling of love from the consciousness that's sitting inside of you. And if you just start the conversation, and to me, that's making your life a prayer. I never liked prayers that were the Christian, oh, thee and thou and art. And, I felt like if I didn't use the proper language, God wouldn't listen to me. And now I realize that God's a constant conversation. And I remember teaching my son that this is your only friend. And having lost his father and just having me, he was aware that in life, you couldn't depend on anything, that people come and go out of your life. And more and more, he started to feel this incredible presence inside of him. And once he said to me when he was 6, he said that there was a gold angel in his heart that was telling him everything he needed to know. So when you put this premise to a child who has no other concept, they immediately can feel it. They immediately understand what you're saying to them. And so years later, when he decided he was going to go have adventures, and he walked and hitchhiked all through North America, Central America, and South America alone. He had a backpack and a tent. And I remember him telling me once that he was going through this forbidden zone called the Darien Gap. It's between Panama and Colombia, and it's all swamp. So there's no roads, there's nothing. No one can go through there. And he decided he was going to march through it. So he's all alone with a compass and a Swiss Army knife. And he said that it was amazing because he could tell he was camping in places that no human had ever been. And this one time he was at the top of a hill and he could see the ocean in the distance, and he thought, oh, and there's a stream. He thought, I'll follow the stream and it will take me to the ocean. And he said this little voice in his head went, I wouldn't do that. Wouldn't you? And he's like, no, look, it's going downhill. There's the ocean. I'm following this stream. And it's like, I wouldn't do that. And he went down, and all of a sudden he slipped and started falling. And he grabbed this twig that was sticking out of the cliff, and it was poison. So his hand shoots off this twig, and now his hand is burning and red and bleeding. He's like, and he's still shooting down this cliff, grabs for another twig, same plant, some poison. So he's like, and he shoots down this slope and slammed into a cliff. And the cliff is where the stream disappeared. The stream disappeared in this cliff. And he said, this voice goes, I told you it wasn't a good idea. He's like, So he had to climb all the way back up the cliff and get out his medical first aid. And he's camped that night at the top of the hill again. And then the next morning, he said the cute voice was gone, and it was this, like the oversoul. And he said it was like, go north. And that voice just became this very abrupt, strong voice. And he did this zigzag pattern and got out to the ocean. So it's amazing when you realize this is your only friend. This is the one who will guide you. So start having the conversation and do your japa, do the Om Namo Narayanaya, because you have to turn that mind off. And that's when, and the more guidance you get, the easier it is for you to take that advice and let go. And the easier it is for you to, like when I made the decision to stop seeing Hollywood producers and go live on the street with the homeless, everyone lost their mind. But it resulted in a book, a film, right? It changed everything. It was the best career move I've ever made. So if I had stayed on the path of meeting with these horrific, corrupt sexual predators in Hollywood, like who knows what would have happened to me? It would have been disastrous. You know, now all the lawsuits are coming out about how these producers behaved. And so thank God I was sidetracked and sent to the beach, because once I had lived with the homeless on Venice Beach, not only did it prepare me for being homeless years later with a baby, but it showed me that God was present everywhere. And these homies, all they did was listen to God. It was an amazing thing to watch, because they would just get up in the morning and go, okay, God, where am I going to get food today? Or where am I going to, get anything? And there's an amazing book, Mutant Message Down Under. I don't know if any of you have read it. And it's about a woman who ended up going walkabout with some Aborigines in Australia. And it was a weird series of circumstances that put her with them. But she said every morning they got up and they faced the sunrise and they prayed. And they would all get the messages, which way to head to get water. They were living in the outback. So they're living in an absolute desert with no visible life, vegetation. But all of them would get the messages in the morning, and they knew which direction to walk for water, how deep to dig to find roots or food. And she said it was an astonishing thing to observe, because they lived completely surrendered to the divine. So that book was called Mutant Message Down Under. And if you have a chance, it's a phenomenal book to read, because this tribe, and they had all declared celibacy, because they said they were so upset with what was happening to the earth because of man, that they didn't want to bring any more souls onto the planet. So they were dying out. They were the last of their kind, because they said that the earth, needed a break from mankind. So they were voluntarily leaving. And Guruji is not telling us to do that, but he is telling us to surrender and listen to him exclusively, especially in these times.
Om Namo